So my name's Brett Fenton, General Manager of the Sydney Institute of Marine Science. In and around Sydney Harbour, we have over 600 unique species of fish. Over 70% of those species are endemic only to Australia. Thinking about and protecting our marine habitats, but not only that, protecting the biodiversity we have is critical for future generations, that they get, the equitable experience that we've been so fortunate to have here. Well, I think it's not only underwater, it's on top of the water these days. It talks really to the improving health of the harbour. If we think about Sydney Harbour, it started its formation 300 million years ago. Our last period of glaciation was 12,000 years ago. It was a river valley. It was carved by glaciers at that time. At that time, the ocean was 120 metres lower than it is today. And so what happened is when those glaciers melted 12,000 years ago, this is a drowned river valley. The water flooded in and the water level rose 120 metres. Since the first Europeans have been here, Sydney Harbour has been the centre of Australia. It's heavily industrialised, heavily urbanised. The natural shoreline is gone from more than 70% of the harbour. And certainly as you get really down towards the Opera House and further west in the Parramatta River, it's 100% built structure. There's almost no natural shoreline left. As a society, we dumped sewage, we dumped chemicals. We didn't think about things like stormwater runoff and urbanisation, the damage that did to our environments, and we degraded the harbour dramatically. But what we've seen in the last 50 years is really an improvement on that. And sure, we'll never get the shorelines back, sediments will remain contaminated for longer periods of time, but we're seeing the overall improvement in the water quality is reflected by the fact that you can see dolphins here. Here in Chowder Bay, which is a really beautiful part of the harbour, we've got a colony of New Zealand fur seals. We know very little about. There's research being done on them at the moment. Do they stay here year-round? Do they go to their breeding grounds in the summer? It was only 2 months ago that we had two whales on their journey, a mother and a calf, that went as far west in the harbour as the Harbour Bridge. A lot of the natural ecologies that are really important for spawning of smaller fish, things like our native seagrasses, have been almost completely degraded out of the harbour. For them to return, it's going to take quite a lot of effort, and that's one of the major projects that we're working on at the Institute is how can we recover our beautiful seagrass meadows, which have almost entirely been lost. So our native seagrass here is Posidonia australis. It's a really slow growing plant. It fruits and it flowers, but it's also been traumatically impacted by our urbanisation, things like runoff into the harbour, but also physical destruction of it, things through boat moorings, swing moorings, lawn mowers for seagrass. If you look at aerial photos, you see mooring scars. Once you've lost that seagrass environment, it doesn't come back without sort of direct intervention. Really common area for fish to not only spawn in, but for smaller species to live in. That they're protected, they've got shelter there. We have 2 species of seahorse in Sydney Harbour, and seahorses are really bad swimmers. In fact, I think it's not one of the Australian species, but one of the worldwide species recognised as the slowest swimmer in the world. They've got these prehensile tails which grab onto things, and that's how they live their lives. And seagrass is a really natural anchor for a seahorse, and because we've lost so much of that environment, the white seahorse is one of only 2 seahorse species globally which is recognised as being endangered, and primarily in Sydney Harbour. That's through urbanisation and loss of habitat, and one of those key habitats is our native seagrasses. A research group out at UNSW, the University of New South Wales, led by Professor Adriana Verges, are looking at ways of restoring native seagrass in and around Sydney Harbour. It's called Operation Posidonia. While it's a scientific program, it's really great because it has a strong community outreach component to it. Because we've had such loss of seagrass in Sydney Harbour, we find that we have to translocate seagrasses from both Broken Bay in the north and Port Hacking to the south. What tends to happen in seagrasses in Eastern Australia, you have large storm events, it uproots them, they're disturbed, they wash up on the beach. We've got this research group who are doing this amazing work, this huge community outreach component. Seagrasses get dislodged after storm events, so in fact they call the community engagement part the Storm Squad. Quite often they're ocean swimming groups, for example, and they go and collect the seagrass that's viable. We bring it back to things like our outdoor aquarium here at the Sydney Institute of Marine Science. We nurture it for a period of time, and then we're able to go and replant it. We can measure the expansion beyond where we originally planted it. Obviously the idea isn't just to go and keep planting it. It's hopefully it becomes self-sustaining and that it starts to spread on its own. So Operation Crayweed happens outside of the harbour. Crayweed's a type of seaweed. It likes violent environments, so wherever you find waves on the east coast of Australia, you find crayweed. Before the 70s, really we had quite nearshore ocean discharges for raw sewage. If you go to Manly, you can kind of still see the remnants of where we just dumped our sewage straight into the beach. And quite often, if you've got a big southeaster swell, as you dump it out, then they just blow it all back on shore. And if you're growing up surfing in that area, you would grow up surfing in shit, effectively. That was one of the primary reasons it's believed that the crayweed disappeared, but no one noticed for more than 20 years. And it wasn't really until the 90s and 2000s that people realised that, all the crayweed's gone. Kelp and seaweed forests and crayweed forests are really important environments and habitats for things like rock lobsters, a really important economic crop right around Australia. When they realised that it had disappeared, the scientists looked at ways that they could restore that, and they formed these great partnerships, with things like surfwear companies, who have a strong interest in environmental restoration. And because the water quality has increased so much since we've stopped, dumping our sewage in nearshore environments, there's a spot at Bondi, for example, where the crayweed has extended more than 200 metres. With a little bit of help, not only self-sustain, but start to thrive again. These are like ecological foundations in our marine environments. So if you take that away, everything else goes. And if you bring that back, then everything else comes back with it. While they're doing less monitoring of biodiversity in that type of study, they're really trying to be focused on what's the coverage they're able to achieve. We have partnerships with local divers, for example. People are seeing species in the harbour they haven't seen for decades. Sea urchins have over-adapted to urbanisation, and it's because we've removed predators from the food chain, things like blue gropers, which would typically clear large populations of urchins. Urchins are like the cows of the sea. They just move through and they leave behind them, they just eat all the kelp, effectively. And so you get these things called urchin barrens. They ran out of food, the urchins ultimately die, and you just get these clear patches of sand. So in the harbour, the way we're restoring kelp where it's been degraded primarily through urchin predation is simply removing the urchins. It's something we do by hand. If you've ever picked an urchin up, I don't recommend it. The teams we have, they've got to have all the right gear, but it's a slow process. The same team who are doing the seagrass restoration have Operation Crayweed. They're also doing the kelp work for us in Sydney Harbour, again based out of UNSW and with collaboration from the University of Sydney. They've got a trial area out at Little Bay, which is sort of near Maroubra. It's a reasonably small area, and I think in 3 years they've been running that trial. They've removed over 7,000 urchins from the area. If we look at the beautiful Chowder Bay and you look at our intertidal areas on a slope quite often. Sydney Harbour's all made of Hawkesbury sandstone. Sandstone weathers in very particular ways and very unique ways. You get lots of, in that intertidal area, things like rock pools, shallows, and when the tide goes up and down, it's an area that's teeming with biodiversity, and it's in fact one of the more important ecological environments that we have in our shorelines. Certainly upriver, nearly 100% of it has been transformed from natural shoreline to artificial shorelines. And what we're trying to do is mimic a lot of natural structures we see. So I think in the living seawall tiles, we have 10 unique designs. Some of them mirror what we'd see in mangrove roots. Some of them mirror what we'd see in small rock pools and pockets. We're able to install them onto vertical built structures, which increases the surface area, increases things like water retention when you have tidal changes. What we see is in a typical installation we have of a seawall, living seawall, we install about 72 panels. That's usually sort of covering a depth of about sort of 2 to 2.5 metres of intertidal range. If you look at the ecological diversity installed living seawall compared to control areas adjacent, we see about 300% improvement in biodiversity. Typically naturally occurring species. We have seen some introduced species there, which that's a problem. We don't want to encourage and populate introduced species into the harbour, which might have come off the hulls of boats and things like that. But again, the studies we've found is if we can control that early on and let the natural species establish, it completely blocks out the introduced species. So again, you kind of get a multiplier effect of restoring local species at the expense of potentially invasive species. And we've got these remarkable, smart people, solving a problem here with seagrass and a problem over here with shoreline degradation. But it's how do we bring that all together? Not just one environmental level, but at a seascape level. Sims has been really fortunate in the last year to be awarded a major grant through the Department of Environment and Planning in New South Wales, which is funded by the Environmental Trust of New South Wales. They've got a program called Seabirds to Seascapes. Half of that program is looking at seal and penguin colonies, primarily ran out of Taronga Zoo and with some other partners. That's not part of the work that Sims is undertaking. The other half of the project is restoration at scale within Sydney Harbour. And so the way we're approaching that is taking those really amazing, unique programs and bringing them all together. Project Restore has 4 elements. We're installing living seawalls, we're doing kelp restoration, we're doing seagrass restoration, and then the final component of it is we're installing artificial fish habitats. The ones we're installing these days look like living seawall tiles. They're 3-dimensional structures where we've removed, for example, seagrasses, and we can't restore those environments fast enough. To bring the fish back. We're giving them artificial structures which replicate that. It gives us time to bring in their native environments, things like seagrasses. It gives them places to live and to spawn. We put in some fish habitats just next to the Opera House. The original ones we did, but they were the first trial, they sit in the seabed, and they were steel structures that encrust with algae and sponge. Sydney's home to one of the white seahorse, which is endangered. We found white seahorse, Sydney seahorses, on those structures next to the Opera House, and it's as far west as they've ever been recorded in the harbour. Just a little bit of a helping hand, the ecology starts to take care of itself. And I look around, there's one person on the beach. It almost feels like he could be anywhere around the world, as opposed to in that middle of a city that's got 5 million people in it. That just by itself makes this a very unique part of not only Sydney, Australia, but globally. Hoping for someone else to take charge and for someone else to make the changes we have to make, and we're going to have to make changes in our lifestyle, right? I think having this kind of deep connection to the environment we live in, it turns hope into action. People start to look at it and go, well, I don't want to lose it, I'll make personal choices. And those personal choices can be everything from the way we choose our elected officials to the choices you make in using single-use plastic, the choice you make in personal transportation. You make dozens and dozens of personal choices every day, whether you realise it or not, that have an impact on the planet. And I think the more connected people are to this and don't want to lose it and don't want to continue to damage it, that's what converts hope to action. I think in a perfect world, we'll never get back what we had. Our Indigenous population have been custodians of this for probably 20,000 years. In 250 years, we have done traumatic damage to it. We're never going to get it back to the pristine state it was even 1,000 years ago. But what I hope is that Sydney-siders, we love what we have, and look through I think large programs of work with government, EPA, policy, legislation, we are able to continue to improve it. Future generations, my kids, their kids, will have equitable access to something that's very special. Right now is the time to change. We're having marine heat waves we've never seen before. I read an article this week from a fisherman who was out fishing for marlin, and he talked about the seasons months in advance of what they would usually have seen. The water's 24 degrees. He's never seen that in October. You can kind of touch and feel the change that's upon us right now. And so my hope is that people step up. It's not too late. They convert hope to action, and that our kids have the same special connection that we have today. It'd be really great for us to be an exemplar globally of what people can do when they collaborate. But if you look at the research output we do here, things like the Project Restore, before that the World Harbour Project, we're leading the way globally on some of these things. Project Restore is the first of its type in the world. What I'd love to see is that other collaborations happen, not only in Australia but globally, where you get this amplification effect of, instead of one group going it alone, more groups putting themselves together and solving real world problems at scale that are going to change the course we're on and give us a different future.